And then we're just going to say user share wordless Metasploit. And I'm just going to double tab in this folder so you can see how many words are actually in here. There's quite a bit of wordless, and you can space, and it has wordless for all different kinds of things built in, and these are all over Kali, so it's good to know your folder locations, but user share wordless is one that we'll use quite a bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to utilize an attack with these Unix passwords here. So we have a Unix users and Unix passwords. We're going to utilize the Unix password list and just try to brute force with that. So we'll say Unix passwords, something like that. And then we're going to need to specify what we're attacking. So we are attacking SSH like this, and our IP address of our machine that we're attacking on port 22. And then we need to have a certain amount of attempts or threads at once, and we're going to limit that to 4. And then I'm going to do a capital V for verbosity, just because I want to see the user attempts flow through so that we can actually see what's going on here. So once you got the syntax ready to go ahead and hit enter. And you're going to see that it's starting to attempt root login password with all these weak passwords here. And hopefully it might find something. But let's go ahead and open up a new terminal here. And we're going to just make this a little bigger, and I'm going to load up Metasploit as well. And we're going to run the same exact thing in Metasploit, but I think it's good to know multiple frameworks and multiple tools to perform the same task. So here we're going to search for something like SSH, and this is going to be an auxiliary module, so we'll just scroll up, and we're going to look for something like SSH login. Perfect. Login check scanner. And make sure we don't have anything else, and that looks good to me. So let's go ahead and take this SSH login, and we're going to go ahead and say use options. And now we have kind of our brute force options here. Let me make this a little bigger so it's prettier. So we've got a brute force speed from 0 to 5, 5 being the fastest. Try blank passwords, no. We can set a hard password, and we could set a hard username. We could set a user and password file, a user as password file. Again, we can have a password file as well. So we have a lot of different options here that we can utilize. But we're going to go ahead and do the same kind of thing. We're going to say set username, and we're just going to say root. And then we're going to say set pass file. And similar to what we just used, we're going to say user share wordless Metasploit. And then we're going to say Unix passwords. And that should set the pass file. And then we just need an R host as well. Set R host. And we'll say 192.168.57.134. Say options one more time. And you can see that we've got our password file set. We've got our R host set. We've got our R port on 22. Threads is 1. Username root. And we should be good to go. Now we could set multiple threads here. We could set threads to like 10. This is really going to amp it up. I mean, this should be detected in a second, but we're going to try to run it. And we could set, actually, let me control C. Let's set verbose to true as well, just so you could see that it's actually working. Set verbose to true, and then we're going to run this. And then it's going to attempt different credentials here, and it'll say, hey, I found it, and it'll light up green, and then we'll know it's good. So this is actually going kind of slow, surprisingly. And you can see here that we are at attempt 112, 116. So this is also going slow. And we do not have a successful attempt or login. I actually don't believe that there's going to be one. But you never know. I believe I remember taking this offline and trying to crack the password, and it wasn't any kind of weak password. So you can let your brute force run if you want to go with it, but I'm going to go ahead and kill mine. And that's it for this video. So from here, we're going to talk about a similar methodology called credential stuffing, which we've already talked about before, except we're not brute forcing, but we're using common knowledge to our advantage. So we'll talk about a little bit of credential stuffing in the next video. Let's talk again about credential stuffing. And while we're at it, we're going to talk about password spraying. Now, I realize we talked about this earlier in the course with breach parse and WeLeakInfo, but I do think that hammering concepts over and over and how important they are does help for information retention. So again, if we look at this example here, what is credential stuffing? Well, it's just injecting breached account credentials in hopes of account takeover. So if you look at the compromised server here in the upper right-hand corner, we pull down usernames and credentials. And we get these from leaks like the LinkedIn link or the Equifax link or whatever of those have come out recently. We get these leaked credentials. And we grab these databases, we search through them like we did with breach parse or like we can with WeLeakInfo, and we get these stolen credentials. And we take these credentials and we try to pass them to the site login. Now, we could take a look at a real life example of that, which I have pulled up here. And again, this is just an example of the Tesla breach parse. So we have some usernames and passwords. We have repeat offenders, remember? We also have similar passwords here. But the art of credential stuffing is taking these passwords and these usernames and throwing them at a website. That's all it is. So we're going to throw them at a website and just kind of spray and pray. Now, I just gone ahead and opened up this same Tesla-master. I've only opened up the users and the passwords just for an example of spraying. This video is going to be in theory only. I don't want you attacking Tesla's website. So just take this for example. You can follow all the way up until the point that we actually hit attack if you want to follow along. But for this, please do not attempt an exploit against Tesla. You do not know when the criteria is going to change, and I just don't want you getting in trouble just in case it does. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and go to Firefox. And while we are in Firefox, what I want to do is I want to take a quick pit stop and go to Google. And I want to look up something called Foxy Proxy. So go ahead and do this. Look up Foxy Proxy like this, not Froxy, Foxy Proxy. And go ahead and click on this top one here, the standard. And we're just going to go ahead and install the standard to our Firefox. And this is going to be a useful tool that we'll be using throughout the course. So, okay, we've got Foxy Proxy installed. Now what has happened up in the right-hand corner, we've got this here. You can see Foxy Proxies here, and we can just say, hey, options. And in the options, we're going to add in a proxy over here on the left. And we're just going to call it Burp Suite. And then over here, we've got proxy types. We're just going to leave this at HTTP. And then we're going to give it an address, which is 127.0.0.1. Same thing as before. And again, this is 8080. We'll just hit save. And then we're going to go ahead and close out. And then all we got to do now is click this and click this. And now Burp Suite's turned on. Super simple. So let's go ahead also to our applications. And let's just go up here and open up Burp Suite. And let's test out our proxy and make sure. Ignore the errors. Don't worry about those. We'll just go ahead and hit next and use burp defaults. And I will give you a second here to catch up because I realize that I might be clicking through a little fast. So once you have everything set up like this, what we're going to do is we're just going to make sure our proxy works. So I'm just going to refresh the page and you can see that it worked. So easy on, easy off. That's all we're looking for here. Instead of having to go in the menu and go to preferences and, go through that whole process, all we got to do is click a little button. We can turn it on or off within a couple clicks. So from here, I'm going to turn the intercept off. And we're just going to go ahead and go to tesla.com. And Tesla should look like this when you go to it. In the upper right-hand corner, there is a sign in button. Go ahead and click sign in. And again, this is just a watch and learn exercise. You can follow along up until the point that we fire the attack. There will be opportunities here in very, very soon videos where you actually get to do this and you can practice along. So from here, let's turn on the intercept and let's go ahead and just put a fake email. We'll just do test@test.com and we'll do test as the password and hit sign in. And that intercepts here. So you can see the user equals, or email equals test@test.com and password equals test. We're gonna go ahead and just right click this and say send to intruder. And from intruder, what we're going to do is we're going to go to positions in here, and then we're gonna clear it. All those green go away because it tries to auto select positions for us. So now what we're gonna do is we're just going to highlight this here, and we're gonna say add. And then we're going to highlight this here, and we're going to say add. So we're selecting two different parameters. We're selecting the email parameter, and we're selecting the password parameter. And now we have different attack types up here. The most common that we're going to use is either sniper, but sniper uses one parameter. So we're actually going to use what is called a pitchfork here. And we're going to go ahead and go over to our payloads. And what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is I'm going to take this list of users and I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to paste it. And then on the second one, I'm going to take my list of passwords and I'm going to paste it. Now, what this is doing, if we go back, payload set 1 is all the usernames. It's going into the first one we set here. Payload set 2, all the passwords. Those are all going into here. And we have 30 total counts, meaning what's happening with this pitchfork is payload 1, number 1, is corresponding to payload 2, number 1. So they only run together. So this will run the username and password. These are just the separated users and passwords. This will run this username against this password here. So what we're going to do is just we start an attack, and it just says, hey, this is a demo version of Intruder because you're on community. Don't worry about that. It still runs. It's just a little slower. I'm going to go ahead and hit pause on the attack. Now, there are some interesting things that we can look for. When we're doing this, what we're looking for is a status code change of some sort. Maybe we see 200s here and we want like a 301, which means a redirect. Or we see a significant change in length. That would be a good indicator that maybe we had a successful login. Other items too is that we can click in here and look at the response, and we can say, okay, what did the response say? And if we scroll down, maybe it said something in here about fail login. Okay, we could not sign you in. And we could just take we could not sign you in like this, copy this, and then we can come back. We'll close this attack. We'll come into options here, and there's actually a grep feature. So we can clear all these in this little box, and we can just paste this and say, yes, match this here. So watch what this does. So we're going to start this attack again, and then I'm going to pause it. And you can know immediately, look at the checkboxes. This means it's showing up in the response. It's grepping it out. It knows immediately that we didn't sign in successfully. So this is an example of a credential stuffing attack. So we're looking for these few different things, a status change, a significant length. Like we're seeing all the same kind of lengths here, but what if it was like 5,000 or 2,000 or 15,000? If the page length changes, there's a good chance that you signed into something and we have a successful login. Same thing here with this. If you can find your error code or what it says and then grep on that, then you can click up here and just sort by that, and you can search for the ones that don't return that and possibly have a login as well. So this is the art of credential stuffing. Now, let's say we wanted to close this out. We want to go back and we want to do password spraying. Well, we're going to go ahead and just clear this out. And if you remember, password spraying is the art of using known usernames without a known password. So we'll just say add here, and we would gather a list of all the possible users that we can think of. We can look at hunter.io. We can look at, the breach password list. We can look at LinkedIn and gather people who work there, come up with this big list, and then actually clear, sorry. No, this is right. We'll add these and we'll have all the different users. And then for this, we'll just change the request to like fall of 2019. Or we can set it up to, we could set this up here like fall 2019 exclamation, or whatever the time frame is, or however you want. Or maybe, you know, they work at Tesla, so maybe we'll do Tesla 1 if they have a weak password policy, or 123, or @ or pound. You just try a few of these. The only downside to this is you are most likely attacking Active Directory accounts. When you're attacking Active Directory accounts, you want to be very careful because you could lock them out without even trying. So if you're doing a pen test, the best idea is to ask before you attack. Say, hey, how many attempts do you have unsuccessfully before a logout happens or a lockout happens? Because the worst thing you want to do is fire off 10 of these in a row, lock out a bunch of users, and cause a denial of service. That is very, very possible and very, very easy to do. So make sure you're not just firing these willy-nilly, that you have a good idea of the password policy, the lockout policy, etc. That'll really help you when you do these attacks. But you just want to do these kind of 1 or 2 at a time, wait a few hours, fire another 1 or 2 at a time, and you should be good to go. Okay, so same deal here. We could fire this and we could just say, you know, I'll just say password 123, and we'll just switch this to sniper here. And if we come to the payloads, you can see it just kept the emails. There is no payload 2 anymore. So what this would do if we hit start attack is it would start firing this against this email address with a password of 123. And then this one with this email address with the password of 123. It would just go down the list. And that's all password spraying is. But the feature that I'm showing you here between credential stuffing and password spraying is by far the most common way that we get in on external assessments. Way, way more than you're ever going to see just an exploit out in the wild, where you're going to see this most likely. And second, you're probably going to see something like default credentials. So if you see a login page, always check default credentials because you never know. You're likely not going to see an exploit out there because the chances are, one, is that if you see an exploit like that out there, who knows who else has seen that already? What kind of bad actors? Because bad actors are scanning the internet all the time for these sorts of things. And if they're seeing it, then guess what? You know, if you're seeing it, then guess what? They're probably have already seen it as well. So that's a bad situation. Two, you got to think of protection, and clients, just think of clients like a house. When you talk about the external of your house, your external, your doors have really good locks on them. You might have 2 locks on your door. You might have good lighting, all this other stuff, right? Like to try to keep bad guys out. But on the inside, some of your doors probably don't even lock. And that's really how you can treat an external assessment. The clients do a really good job of, you know, buffing up their external. But when it comes to the internal, it's not usually as good. So same thing with physical assessments as well. You gotta get inside. Once you're inside, it's kind of easy breezy for the most part. So take that lesson away. If anything you take from the course, again, at least for the external side, take away that enumeration and information gathering is super important because you want to get to this stage here where you are doing these credential stuffing attacks. And you can use Burp Suite for it. This is my favorite go-to. There's other methods as well, but it's so easy just to grab any different website and just, you know, intercept the proxy, send it to an intruder, make one modification and fire it off. So super, super simple. This is something you will come up in an interview as well. So make sure you're very aware of it and make sure you watch this again if you need to understand the concepts. So from here, we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at our notes in the next video, just kind of where I want you to be with your notes. And then we're going to get into what I call that mid-course capstone, where I'm going to show you a bunch of different hacks and just my thought process and theories and thinking when I go into a scan and looking at results. And just so you can kind of get into the mind of an attacker and how we think. And then we'll start moving on to exploit development and my favorite, the Active Directory exploitation. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Let's briefly cover our notes so far. So we have covered a little bit of this, right? We covered the fact that we have our Nmap in here and what we saw in port 22, port 80, etc. And we had a couple of findings from before. We had default web page on Apache, and we had this information disclosure as well. Now we've done some exploiting. So I've gone ahead and just put in here, I put the SMB exploit. So I put an example of what it looks like when we run it. And you could see that the whoami and the host name's in there. And then I've got the IP address. This is just for my notes. You can make this as detailed as you want, by the way. You could say, hey, I ran this at this specific time, and I ran it against this host, and here was the attack I ran, etc. And we'll get more into what your report should look like, but as long as you know, at least for me, as long as I know, or I have a screenshot of proof that I did it, and I have the IP address that I ran it against, that's pretty much enough. I can remember the rest and then type out the report. And same here with the mod SSL attack on port 80 and 443. And I don't have a copy of it right now, but the shadow file, we did uncover the shadow file as being a root user. So this is just notes for us. Perhaps we could use the shadow file information and crack the passwords, or we could go on and try to pass the password or pass the hash around, which we'll get to in later videos. And another thing that I added in here too was undetected malicious activity. So this is something that you're going to see on a report, and we talked about in the brute forcing video, where if we're doing any kind of brute forcing, we're doing it not only to see if we can get in with a bad password, but to see if the client catches us. So in this example, I'm just going to say, hey, they didn't catch us. Here's an example of what we did. Also scanning in there as well. If they're not seeing a scan, that's something that we're going to report back. So this would be typically a low finding. These would also be low findings. Anytime we get access to a machine, this is obviously a critical finding. So we just want to keep note of, what kind of things we're finding, take good pictures, etc. So I'm hoping that you are getting the gist now of what your notes should look like. Again, make these your own, however it feels good to you. This is just how I kind of do it. I don't have to put a ton of information in there for me to remember, as long as I have my screenshots, which are most important because that's your proof that you were actually there and you did it. Otherwise, it's just he said, she said kind of thing. So that is it for this video. That is it for this section. Congratulations again for making it this far. Now we're going to move into some of the fun stuff where we get to look at a bunch of different attacks and gradually just get a little bit more complex and learn some new things along the way. So I will catch you over in the next section. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the exploit development part of our course. I'm really excited about this because we get to start putting together some of the things we've been learning, including Python and MSF Venom to build our own payloads, and it's going to be really fun. So what we're going to be doing in this course is we're going to be using an attack machine and a victim machine. So the victim machine has to be a Windows machine. So you can run it in a VM. I have a VM here. Or you can utilize your own Windows machine if you're running through this course on a Windows-based machine. If you're running on a Mac or you're running on Linux, then you're going to have to virtualize this Windows machine. Now, shouldn't be too big of a deal if you're already running in a VMware situation or a VirtualBox situation. All we have to do is go out to the interwebs here, and if you go to Google and you just type in Windows Evaluation, the first thing that comes up should be Microsoft Evaluation Center. And you just click into there. And we scroll down just a little bit and it says check out the latest products. We're going to say check out Windows. And right here it says Windows 10 Enterprise. That's fine. Now I'm going to be running the whole course through Windows 10 Pro. It really doesn't matter as long as you're on Windows 7 or newer. So if you have Windows 7, 8, or 10, that's absolutely fine. And then you just click through here, say I want the ISO of Enterprise, and then just fill out all of your information, hit continue, get the ISO file and download it, and then load the ISO file into your VMware. That is the option if you are running it virtualized. If you're on a Windows machine, as I will be when I'm running through the course, you do not have to download this part. Now there are two items you will need to download. Both of these are going to be on your Windows machine. So on your victim machine, we're going to have something called Vuln Server. If you go to Google and say Vuln Server is the vulnerable server that we're going to be attacking. So this is a server that we're going to have running on this machine. It's going to allow us to write a custom exploit against this and get a reverse shell. It's going to be really fun. So we're going to actually use the gray corner right here from 2010. If you click on this and scroll down, there is a download button down here. It says vulnserver.zip. Now, Windows may actually block this download. If Windows blocks this download, go ahead and turn off your Defender. I'm going to actually have you turn it off once we start the spiking video, but you can go into Defender and just turn it off in here in Windows Defender settings if you need to. So you have virus and threat protection right here. You can see that I have it turned off. You can just have it turned off. So from here, we can just download our attachment. And I'm just going to hit open because it's a .zip. So again, you're going to need a .zip of some sort. And then I just like to extract this out to my desktop is fine. Just somewhere easy to be able to get to it. And then we can extract the actual or unzip this whole thing right to our desktop. We'll just call this vuln server like this. Something similar to this is absolutely fine. What's important is that we're able to have all these files on our desktop. So that's exactly what we want here. And then the second part is Immunity Debugger. So if we come over one tab here, we've got Immunity Debugger from Immunity Inc. And this is the link we want to click on. Now what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to run the program through this debugger, and then we can see all sorts of cool stuff. It's a program debugger. So when we are triggering different types of exploits, we can see how it's affecting the memory, the stack, how it's affecting the program, and it'll make a lot more sense once we're in there, but it's really, really nice. So if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see it says download, and it says download Immunity Debugger here. This is all we gotta do, and you can put a fake name in here. You can put Joe Schmo, and then however you'd spell that, and then put a 123 fake street, etc. fake at fake.com, and then fake here, and it should let you download it. You don't have to put in your real information, and see it just works right away. Hit save, and then once it's done downloading, we're going to go ahead and get this installed. So if it takes you some time for this to download, go ahead and just pause your video, and then we're going to go ahead and keep going. So I'm going to say run on this and say yes. And it's going to say that it needs to install Python 2.7. So we're just going to say yes and say I accept, next, and install. Close that. Now it's going to launch the Python installer. We're just going to do it for all users. If you have an issue with that, you can install it just for you as well. Next, next, next. Let this load, and it's all very, very point and click on this. So our goal here is to be able to write our own exploit code by the end of this, and it's going to actually be really fun. So let's go check and make sure that Immunity ran. And this is what Immunity looks like the first time you load it up. So from here, we've got everything installed. We're going to watch a short video on what a buffer overflow is and how we are going to leverage it. And then we're going to get right into the hands-on portion of attacking this victim machine here from our Kali machine and getting a reverse shell off of this victim machine. So I will catch you over in the next video when we start covering what a buffer overflow actually is. So let's talk about anatomy of memory. So when we talk about anatomy of memory, we have the kernel at the top and we've got text at the bottom. So if you think of your kernel, think of your command line. You can also think about this as a bunch of ones. And your text, you can think about as your read-only code, and you can think about that as a bunch of zeros. So this is only for informational purposes, but we can also call this the kernel the top, the text the bottom. Where we're really going to be focused on, though, is going to be the stack. So if we dive into this memory here and we dive even deeper and we go into the stack, it's kind of similar. So we have these registers here, and I'll provide links down below on how to brush up on some of these registers if you're not familiar. But the important things, what we need to know for this lesson, is that you have the ESP, you have your buffer space, your EBP, and your EIP. So we can think about this again as the ESP sitting at the top and the EBP sitting as the bottom.
So what happens is you have this buffer space, and this buffer space fills up with characters. So the buffer space is going to go downward. What should happen is if you're properly sanitizing your buffer space, then if you send a bunch of characters at it, say a bunch of A's, for example, like this, you should reach the EBP but stop. The buffer space should be able to contain the characters that you're sending. Now, however, if you have a buffer overflow attack, then you actually overflow the buffer space you're using and reach over the EBP and into something called the EIP. Now, the EIP is where things get interesting. This is a pointer address or a return address. So what we can do is we can use this address to point to directions that we instruct. Now, these directions are actually going to be malicious code that gives us a reverse shell. So we're going to learn that later on in future videos as we go step by step. So this doesn't have to seem very logical right now. You just have to very, very base level understand that what's happening in the stack is that you're overflowing buffer space. So if you can write over the buffer space and write down all the way to the EIP, you can control the stack and you can control the pointer, and eventually you can have a reverse shell, which will lead to root. So it's going to make a lot more sense when we dive into hands-on. This is just more of a theoretical thing. So let's talk about really quick the steps to conduct a buffer overflow. So the first step we're going to cover is called spiking. So spiking is going to be a method that we use to find a vulnerable part of a program. Once we find the vulnerable part of the program, we're going to do fuzzing, which is kind of similar to spiking. So fuzzing, we're going to send a bunch of characters at a program and see if we can break it. If we do break it, we want to find out at what point we did break it, right? So we want to find something called the offset, and we use that offset to overwrite the EIP, that pointer address that we were talking about. Once we have the EIP controlled, we need to do a few house cleanup things. One is called finding bad characters. The other is called finding the right module. This doesn't need to make sense right now. But once we do that, and we have this information from steps 5 and 6, we can generate shellcode, this malicious shellcode that will allow us to get this reverse shell. So we're going to use that. We're going to point that EIP to our malicious shellcode, and hopefully we're going to gain root. So again, this will all make sense as we dive into the future videos and we get hands-on. So if you look at these videos, these are the videos that are going to come. So our next video is going to be on spiking, second one's going to be on fuzzing, and so on. So if you have trouble with one area in particular, you can watch that area specifically and not have to look through a long video and hopefully break this down into little nuggets. All right, everybody, let's get started with spiking. So before we get started, we're going to do a couple of housekeeping things. First, I want you to disable your Windows Defender real-time protection if you have that enabled. So it looks something like this, where you should turn off this button right here. We're doing that because Vuln Server will actually be blocked by Windows Defender if you try to run it and then run anything malicious against it. So good on Windows Defender for picking this up. This is more recent, as I've taught this in the past and never used to, but now it does. So we're going to make sure that we turn off this real-time protection. And then we're going to make sure that when we run our programs today, our immunity debugger, and we run our Vuln server, that we're running them as administrator. So let's go ahead and first get our Vuln server running. So remember, I told you to extract that to a folder. Here's my Vuln server folder. I'm going to right click on this and I'm just going to run it as administrator. So now that I've got that running, it should look something like this. And we're also going to run immunity as administrator. So we're going to do that because if we don't, it's actually not going to see Vuln server running as administrator and be able to access it. So we need both running as admin. And the other reason is for Vuln server running as admin is when we get the shell on this, we're actually going to end up as root automatically. So we just want this in the most simple terms. So I'm going to bring immunity over here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to File, and we're going to say Attach. And if you scroll down, you'll see Vuln server right here. I'm going to go ahead and just hit Attach on that. Okay, in the bottom right corner, you see that it says pause. What we're going to do is just hit Start over here, this play button up top. and now it should say running. So if you're running, then we are good to go. So now we're going to dive into our Kali Linux machine. So I'm in a command prompt in Kali Linux. And the first thing I want to do is connect to Vuln Server and see what it is. So by default, Vuln Server runs on port 9999. And you need to know the IP address of your Windows machine that it's running on. So once you know that, what we can do is use a tool called Netcat. We'll use a switch of NV. We're going to do a connection here. And we're just going to say the IP address. So mine is 1.90. And then the port that you're going to connect on, which is 9999. Okay, so you should see the screen that says welcome to vulnerable server. Type help for help. So it's saying help in all caps. We're going to do that, all caps. And then we get this list of valid commands. So it looks like Vuln Server takes commands based on what you enter, right? So there's a stats command, rtime, ltime, etc. So the primary command that we're going to be focusing on is this trun command. Now, when I've taught this in the past, I've left out actually how to find this. So I wanted to teach in depth how we're going to find that trun itself is vulnerable. So we're going to do something called spiking. What spiking does is we're going to take this command one at a time. We'll say like stats, and we're going to say, hey, stats, I'm going to throw a bunch of characters at you and see if I can overflow that buffer that we talked about in the previous video. So do we overflow the buffer? Does the program crash? If it does, then we know, hey, stats is vulnerable. If it doesn't, okay, maybe it's not vulnerable. We'll move on to the next one. So I'm going to show you what a non-vulnerable one looks like and what a vulnerable one looks like, and we're going to look at stats and trun for that purpose. So when we spike, we're going to use a tool called generic TCP, and it's going to look something like this. Let's go ahead and Control C, or actually we'll just type exit out of this if we can. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use, it's called generic send TCP. Let's type that in real quick. Okay, so here is the usage for this. You're going to need the host. Okay, we know the host of 192.168.1.90. You're going to need the port. We know that. You're going to need a spike script. And then you're going to need these skip variables here, which we're just going to leave at 0. So this is what the usage should look like. But we need this spike script. So let's go ahead and talk about that first. So I've already gone ahead and pre-written it. It's very, very simple. So let's take a look at it in gedit. So first we're going to look at stats. So we're going to have stats.spk for spike. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the line. Then we're going to take a string, and the string is stats. Remember, that's what we had here, the stats command. And then we're just going to send a variable at it. Okay, and then when we spike this, we're going to send variables in all different forms and iterations. So it might send 1,000 at a time, then 20,000 at a time, then 5 at a time. It's just looking for something to break the program. So that's what spiking is. We're going to send all kinds of different characters randomly, essentially, to try to break this part of the program. So now we're getting into specifics here. So if you can imagine, we've got this stats.spike. We're also going to have the trun.spike, and the trun's going to have this trun command here. So if you're following along, make sure that you type this out just how I have it, just these 3 simple lines. Go ahead and save it as stats.spike. And what we're going to do is we're going to send this. So again, we're going to say generic send TCP. And then we know the host is 192.168.1.90. The port is 9999. The spike script is stats.spike. And then we're going to just say 0 space 0. Now we've got immunity running right now over here. If you have multiple screens, you can run it on multiple and kind of watch what happens. If we hit enter here, it's going to just be running through this. This is running. You can see that it's taking commands, but nothing's really happening. We'll let it run through all the way just to make sure. And so you're going to see a little bit of a different action when we do have something vulnerable. So we're going through, looks like we're connecting. If we look at Vuln server, you can see that we're actually connecting to the client here and then disconnecting from the client as we send these commands over. So I'm going to go ahead and just kill this for now. You can hit Control C. Doesn't look like it's vulnerable. In a real test, we'd let it run all the way through, but I'm telling you now it's not vulnerable, so we'll just save a little bit of time. So now let's take a look at the Trun spiking. Again, should look the same, but you should have a trun.spike similar to this. So if you want to go ahead and type this out, and we have this trun command here. So when we send this spike, I'm just going to tab up twice and change this to trun. And then again, we have to make sure immunity is running. You see it's running in the corner. We're going to go ahead and hit send on this. And immediately immunity starts blinking. What happened? We have paused over here. There's an access violation when executing. Okay, let's go ahead and just kill the process in Kali because we don't need to keep sending all these. So your Vuln server has actually crashed. You're not seeing an error message because it's being held up by the immunity debugger. If we were to actually detach or unpause this, then Vuln server would crash. So we've hit a violation. This is really good. This says, hey, something's vulnerable here. And if we look at the registers, we can kind of get some information. So one of the informations that we're picking out is, okay, we're seeing this trun command sent, right? And we're sending this trun command with a bunch of A's. So imagine this going into a buffer space, right? Like we talked about before. Okay, we're sending this command, A. In a perfect world, the trun command, or this should all fill into a buffer space, right? All these A's. Well, what's happened here is that it's actually filled over. So if we look at the EBP, remember the base register, right? You see 41414141. That's just hex code for 4 A's. So we've got these here, these 4 bytes, right? And we've gone actually over the ESP as well, a bunch of A's here. Okay, and we've gone over the EIP. So now we've overridden everything. Remember when we talked about in the last video, the EIP is the important factor. If we can control this EIP, we can get malicious and point it to something malicious, right? So that's what we're going to do in the next couple of videos. So I've showed you how Trun itself can be spiked and found. In the next video, what we're going to actually be covering is how to fuzz the Trun command with a Python script. So that way you can kind of feel out how this process is done in another way called fuzzing. So it's going to be very, very similar where we send a bunch of A's, and it might feel like a little bit of a repeat lesson, but we're going to build out a Python script to do that. And then once we do that, we're going to work on finding this EIP location, because once we control that, again, we can inject malicious code. So step 1 done. I will see you in the next video for fuzzing. All right, everybody. So in this video, we're going to be covering fuzzing. Fuzzing is very similar to spiking in the sense that we're going to be sending a bunch of characters at a specific command and trying to break it. The difference is with spiking, we're trying to do that to multiple commands to try to find what's vulnerable. Now that we know the trun command is vulnerable, we're going to go ahead and attack that command specifically. So a couple housekeeping items. We're going to go ahead and boot up Immunity Debugger again. So we're going to administrator. And we're also going to run Vuln server as administrator. So from here on out, you can assume that Vuln server is going to be running and immunity is going to be running, and then we're going to have it attached. So let's go ahead and show that process one more time. And anytime that you do crash Vuln server, we're going to go ahead and restart it and restart immunity as administrator and reattach. So there are issues sometimes where if you crash Vuln server and then you try to reload it with immunity already open, it causes issues. So it's best to just close out of immunity as well, reopen immunity, and start it again. So let's go ahead and make sure everything's running. It is in the corner. Okay, so let's go to our Kali machine now that we have this out of the way. And I've built out a script in Python that we're going to use to fuzz. Let's go ahead and take a look at that script. So we're going to say gedit. I called this one.py. You could do that as well. And if you want to pause the video now and write this out, copy this down, that's fine. You could also do it while I'm talking if you want to save some time. So I'm just going to go line by line and kind of talk about this code, and then we'll see what it does. So from the top, we're just declaring that it's Python. We're going to import a few modules here. We're going to import sys and socket. That way that we can call out the specific IP and port. We're also going to import sleep. That way we can sleep it for a second before trying this process over again. So with those imports out of the way, what we're really focused on is we're declaring a buffer variable here, right? So this variable is called buffer, and inside buffer we have 100A. So we've got this A times 100. So what we're going to do is we're going to say while true. So we're going to loop this, right? We're going to say while true, I want you to try something. What we're going to try is we're going to try to connect to this socket. And the socket, all that is this AFI net, that's your IPv4, and the sock stream, that's your port. So we're going to say, hey, let's connect to this IP address. Remember, this is my IP address for my Windows machine that's running Vuln Server. So we're going to connect to this IP address. We're going to connect to this port. And then once we do that, we're going to send over a trun command. Remember, we spiked the trun command, found it was vulnerable. And when we spiked it, when we looked at the registers, we actually saw this little bit of extra information here. So we've got this little command that goes after the trun that needs to go in there in order for the program to actually understand it. So that's why this has been added here. So we say, hey, send over this message, send over trun, and then also send over the buffer. So send trun with 100 A's. Okay, then close that connection, go to sleep for a second, and then we're going to append to buffer another 100 A's. So what we're going to keep doing is as long as there's a connection here, we're going to keep sending you buffers. And it's going to get bigger and bigger. So next time we're going to send 200, then we're going to send 300, 400, etc. until this thing breaks. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to really narrow down where it's breaking and at what specific byte size. So what we're doing here is we're going to fuzz it. And then once it breaks, it should print out an exception that says, okay, fuzzing's crashed at X bytes, right? So let's go ahead and see what that's going to look like. So go ahead and save this file if you haven't already. One other important thing we need to do is we need to change the mode on this to execute. So we'll say change mode +x 1.py. That way we can execute this. And just again to confirm, we've got immunity running. So let's go ahead now and say 1.py. Hit enter. And you should see the connections coming through here on Vuln Server. So every time it's doing this, it's sending a new 100 bytes. We can watch immunity for the crash. The crash should happen pretty quick. And then once it does, you can kill the program because sometimes it doesn't kill itself. So it's not the best. There we go. We paused it. No more connections. So let's go ahead, go into Kali, hit Control-C, and we crashed somewhere around 2,700 bytes, give or take. Okay, so let's look at the crash. So again, we see the crash came through, and we've got a bunch of A's sitting here. We didn't look like we actually overwrote the EIP. That's fine. We just need to know approximately where we crashed at. So we'll just call it, for even round numbers, that we crashed somewhere around 3,000 bytes. So what we're going to be doing in the next video is we're actually going to be finding where the EIP is at. So how we're going to do that is we're going to use a tool that's going to create these random, not really random, there's cyclical values that we're going to send out. And then we're going to say, okay, what is the EIP value and where does it correspond in the specific number of bytes that we sent over? So remember, controlling this EIP value, let's go back to it. Controlling this EIP value is what's the most important. Once we can control this EIP value, we do a little bit of housekeeping in our exploit development process, and then we point this guy to our malicious code and we get root. So we want this EIP, we want to control it, and in the next couple of videos, we're going to learn how to do just that. So I will catch you over in the next video when we cover finding the offset. So when we talk about finding the offset, we kind of talked about in the last video, we're going to be looking for where we overwrite the EIP because that's what we want to control. Now, lucky for us, there is a tool already out there that will help us do this. And this tool is provided by Metasploit Framework. It's called Pattern Create. So in our Kali machine, we're going to go ahead and just get that set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to say user share Metasploit framework tools exploit pattern create. Okay, now we're going to have to give this a couple switches, actually just one for the first one. We're going to give it a switch of L for length, and the switch of L, we're going to say 3000. So why 3000? Well, if you remember the last video, what happened was we found somewhere around 2700 bytes is where the Vuln server program crashed. And then I said, hey, let's just make it an even 3000. It'll be nice. This is where it comes into play. So we're going to take 3000 bytes and we're going to hit enter here. What's going to happen is it's going to generate this crazy cyclical code here that we're going to actually have to send into Immunity and Vuln server. So you see all this jumbled stuff. All we're going to do is just take it and we're going to copy it. And then we're going to modify our script that we created earlier just a little bit. And I've gone ahead and done that. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So let's go ahead. I called it 2.py. If you want to modify your 1.py and make it easier from the last video. And then I did a little test here just to make sure it worked. But what we're going to do is we're going to paste this value into here. But first I want to cover this script. So remove some things, remove the time because we don't need it. We still have the import sys and socket. We don't need a while loop anymore. We can just say try. And we're going to do the same connection, just try in the connection, make sure we connect to that address. And then we're going to send this offset, right? So I'm going to go ahead and paste that value into here. You can go ahead and work on getting this set up. What we're going to do is we're going to send this value and then we're going to close the connection. If for some reason we cannot access it, then we'll throw an exception and say error connecting to server, and then we'll exit out. So what we're going to do is when we send this in, we're going to get a value on the EIP. So we're going to see that the program crashes, and then the value on the EIP is going to come back. And then we're going to use a tool, and we're going to say, hey, okay, Metasploit, I found this value on the EIP. What is the offset? So we've got this pattern create right now, and then we're going to have pattern offset here in a second. So let's go ahead and get this saved up. Once you're ready, go ahead, hit save. Same thing again, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to change the mode like we did last time to execute on 2.py. And also we're going to need to get Immunity running and Vuln server running. So I'm going to do that really quick here. Okay, it should look like this. Hit play, make sure we're running in the bottom, and then go ahead and fire off that script. Okay, should throw an exception right away. And you see now that we have this trun command that came through with our values that we sent, right? You see this cyclical value goes to the A's. It crosses over the EBP, down the EIP, even comes through the ESP, right? So what we're doing here is we have completely overwritten everything. We've gone too far because we've crossed this ESP, but really what we're interested in is this EIP. We want to be able to control this value. So we see this value in here is 386F4337 right here. This is what we need and are interested in. So let's see how we can make this value of use. So if we come back to this screen and let's just tab up a couple and we'll go here and just backspace. What we're going to say is instead of pattern create, all we're going to say is pattern offset. We're going to give it the same switch of L and we're going to say 3000. But one thing we need to add in here is a switch of Q, and that's for our finding. So our finding was 386 F as in Foxtrot 4337. And now if we hit enter here and we did it right, we should find a pattern offset, meaning that somewhere inside of these 3000 bytes, it found this pattern and it relayed back to it. So if you see here, we actually do have an exact offset match at 2003 bytes. This information is critical because that tells us now that at 2003 bytes, we can control the EIP. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video. We're going to look at the EIP and see if we can control it. So we're going to try to overwrite it with very specific bytes and see if those bytes show up. So let's go ahead and move on to there. Okay, so now we're going to try to overwrite the EIP. So in the last video, we discovered that the offset was at 2003 bytes. What that means is there's 2003 bytes right before you get to the EIP, and then the EIP itself is 4 bytes long. So what we're going to try to do is overwrite those 4 specific bytes. So as always, go ahead and get your Immunity Debugger running with Vuln Server attached. When you have that, let's go ahead and hop right into Kali Linux. This should be a pretty short video. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and just gedit the last script that we wrote, which was 2.py. And we're going to modify this together. So what we can do here is we can just delete this offset variable because we don't need that anymore. And instead, we can just write shellcode here. And we'll switch out this offset variable to shellcode. And then let's go ahead and set this equal to A times 2003 plus B times 4. So let's make sense of this real quick. We're replacing what we sent before to find the offset with the shellcode. Now the shellcode's nothing but A's and B's right now, but it's going to get malicious in a minute. So what we're doing here is we're sending 2003 A's. Why? Because that's where the EIP starts. So byte 2004 starts the EIP. So what we're doing is we're sending a bunch of A's, but we want to make sure that we don't overwrite the EIP with A's and have no idea if we're correct or not. So remember, A's are 4 1s, B's is going to then be 4 2. So in theory, we should see 4 2, 4 2, 4 2, 4 2 on the EIP when we overwrite it. So let's go ahead and just fire this guy off. I'm going to save this, and you could save it as .3 if you want. I'm just going to keep it .2 to make it simple. And then what we're going to do is 2.py. Remember, if you did make it a new file, go ahead and change the mode. And since we have Vuln Server running and attached to Immunity Debugger, we should be able to fire this guy off. And it should break the program. So we have pause down here, access violation, great. Okay, so let's talk about what happened here. So you see the EAX, Trun ran through, bunch of A's, we're used to seeing that. EBP, 414144141, good, came through, but look here, the EIP is 42424242. Now we only sent 4 bytes of B's and they all landed on the EIP. Guess what? That means we control this EIP now. So from here, it's pretty smooth sailing. We got a couple of housekeeping things we got to do in terms of finding bad characters and finding the right module to send this to. But once we do that, we're going to generate some shellcode. We're going to point this EIP here instead to that return address that's going to be malicious, and then we're going to gain root. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, just to reiterate, we have controlled the EIP, and now we're going to start to get malicious. So in the next video, we're going to talk about finding bad characters. Okay, so now we're going to talk about finding bad characters. When we talk about finding bad characters, we're talking about this in relation to generating shellcode. When we generate shellcode, we need to know what characters are good for the shellcode and what characters are bad for the shellcode. We can do that by running all the hex characters through our program and seeing if any of them act up. By default, the null byte x00 acts up. So we're going to take a look at what these look like and if any of these bad characters act up in our program. So let's go ahead and actually go out to Internet Explorer or Firefox in Kali. Okay, and in a small update to the course, the link I was going to have you go to, or I did have you go to, no longer exists. So my bad chars now looks a little bit different, but what we're going to do is we're going to go to the first one here, which is the Cytopia. It is actually a bad char generator. It's a tool. You're welcome to download it and set it up. Fairly easy to install with pip if you want.